Let's talk a little bit more about media. So go ahead and in your assist project, open up this practice bit. Now, when you bring anything into Media Composer, the way that you do it is through something called the source browser. So if you go up to File, Input, Source browser, you will end up with something that looks like this. This is the source browser. So the source browser is basically a window where you can view media, change settings, you can import, you can link. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the folder on your desktop. On a Mac, that will be in, I guess, just desktop right here. I'm going to go to the folder called AEB 2024 Media. I'm going to go into the part 1 folder. I'm going to choose media, and then I'm going to choose practice. And you'll see that I have 2 folders in here. I have for import and for link. When you import something in Avid, it basically generates media and places it into a folder on your system. When you link to something in Avid, it's more like what every other program calls importing. Very confusing, I know. If you are used to Premiere, for example, when you import something in Premiere, you're not generating any new media. All you're doing is creating a reference to a file somewhere in your file system. So when you link to something in Avid, instead of generating media, it's actually just referencing the file as it exists wherever you linked to it. So you'll see if I hit link, it has this little chain icon. And if I right click, you'll see that if I hit reveal file, it brings me to that H.264 file. This file is linked. And if I move the H.264, if I move it outside, if I double click on it, you'll see that the media is now offline because it was referencing that H.264 file and I just moved it. So that's linking. The alternative to linking, as I mentioned before, is importing. But in a traditional Avid workflow, importing was done through QuickTime. And the QuickTime framework was very slow. So there was sort of this idea that you would only import stuff that didn't take forever. So you would import your audio and you would import your pictures, and then everything else you would link and you would transcode, because the link and transcode engine has always been much faster than the import engine. But over the last few years, Apple removed support for the QuickTime framework from macOS, starting with macOS Catalina. Because of that, you could not actually import a lot of different types of media on a Mac that you could import on Windows. Beginning with 2023.12, Avid has done something that they should have done years ago, which is they've basically made it all seem like the same thing. So what I would have had to do on a previous version of Media Composer is if I tried to import this, it would have given me an error. I would have had to link to it, and then I would have had to go to Consolidate Transcode. Beginning with 2023.12, if I link to this file, you'll see it shows up in the bin. If I import it, what it will do is in the background, without you even having to worry about it, it will link to it and transcode it. And you'll actually notice that because if I, let's say, import this ProRes clip, you will see it show up in my bin with a link icon on it up until the point where it's done importing. And then it will go to an actual media clip. Instead of using the source browser, if all of your settings are correct, you can just drag and drop. And if you want to link, you can option drag and drop. One reason that linking is super useful, especially over importing, even now, is that if I select folders and I hit import, it would do nothing. So if you have a bunch of camera masters that are within folders, so you have a directory with a bunch of subfolders in it with camera masters deep within those folders, if you try to import them, it will not work. But if you link to them, linking will actually go through and find everything in those folders and it will pull it into Media Composer. So I would strongly recommend linking instead of importing if you're dealing with a large directory. Now you can also do that from the Finder. If you want to link to everything in this folder, you just hold Option, drag it, and drop it in here, and it will find everything in the folder and it will link to it. What is Avid doing when I import it? What it's doing is it is transcoding the clip, and it is placing the transcoded clip into a specific folder, either on my system or on an external drive. Wherever it's going is determined by this right here. So when I import, you'll see that I have an option for what video and audio drive I want it to go to. If I have it on link, that option isn't there because it's not actually generating any new media. And I also have a resolution option when I import because it's generating that new media. So when I hit import, you'll see it transcodes and converts. And then when I right click on it, instead of taking me to that original linked H.264 clip, it brings up the actual Avid Media Files folder where that file got imported to. So with Avid Media, Avid stores all of its media as MXF files, but they're specifically MXF OP Atom files. So you'll notice that if I have a file in here that has one video track and two audio tracks, if I right click on it and go to reveal file, it'll actually highlight all three files. So you see it's got one file, two files, three files, and you can actually tell from the file name what they are. This is the video track. This is A1 and this is A2. So that's the Avid Media folder. The reason that Avid uses Avid Media is mostly historical, but it's also still really useful today because it allows you to have a really robust system for organizing your media and not having to worry about stuff getting moved. The way that Avid Media works is that it's actually tracked within this folder. And I mentioned before that Avid has a very rigid structure for how this folder has to be organized. And the reason for that is that it actually tracks everything in these media file folders. So if I go to reveal file, you'll see that it's selected all of the files that are associated with this clip. If I were to take those files and move them outside of this folder, if I go back to Media Composer, you'll see that it scans that folder. And the reason for that is that it actually looks at this folder and it noticed that there is one file missing from that folder. And the reason that it knew that is because it actually writes a database to this folder called an MDB file. So this file right here, this MDB file, is Avid's index of this folder. Now the MDB can be created at any time. Let me go ahead and create a 5. And if I drop this in 5, you'll see that this clip is offline because it doesn't have the blue line on it. If I go back to Media Composer, you'll notice that it scans quickly. And now the clip is online because what it did, as you saw before, I just created that 5 folder, but as soon as I look in it, you'll see there's now an MDB and a PMR file because Avid just created those two files based on what was in that folder. Now, these files are useful in more than just scanning the folder because they actually contain information about the contents of the folder. So, for example, if I were to delete this clip in Avid, I've now lost all reference to that clip. What do? I can't get it back. It's gone from my bin. I still have the media, but I have no idea how to get that media back into Avid. Well, I can actually use the MDB file and just drag and drop it into the bin, and it will give me that clip back. So the MDB itself contains the contents of the Avid Media Files folder. And if you're on a Nexus or shared storage, things are even a little more complicated. So on a Nexus, if I look at the shared storage here, you'll see that if I look in the Avid Media Files folder, MXF, there's not just numbered folders, but there's numbered folders with the name of each system. And the way that this works is that the system that brings the media in generates the folder with its name followed by a number. And the whole idea behind that is if you have multiple systems generating media on the same Nexus drive at the same time, if you just had numbers, then you could have two systems trying to write to the same folder at the same time, and that doesn't work. So instead, you have before the number, the name of the system that is writing to that drive. So you can tell by this that this system, PH10, did not import or ingest any media onto this drive, only 11 and 12. Let's see if we have another one here that has media on it. Okay, so here. So this is actually, there's nothing in there, but let's put some media in it. Why not? So I'm going to go ahead and move this media in here. And you'll notice that when I go back to Media Composer, it scans because it saw a folder on the Nexus with its name. If I were to change this folder to, let's say, ZPH09, and then add more media to it, when I go back to Avid, you'll notice it doesn't scan because this is not ZPH09. And this is noteworthy because if Avid isn't open on ZPH09, then that media is going to be offline for everybody because I just removed it from a location where it had been scanned and put it into a location where it hasn't been scanned. So in order for that media to show up as online again, I would either need to rename this folder back to ZPH10 or any other system where Avid is open, or I would need to start up Avid on ZPH09.
So if you're gonna do this, if you're gonna move anything in like this numbered folder view, you don't want to do it without being in an active version of Avid that's looking at this so that it does that scan.
Yes. And you
Okay.
definitely don't want to do it when anyone's working unless you know exactly what you're doing. Because if
Got
you move files around into folders, there's no system to immediately rescan those files. They will show up as offline.
it. Okay.
One more thing to note, the numbers are 100% arbitrary. And you can actually use that to your advantage. If you're transcoding footage, what I like to do is I like to transcode all of my footage and then move it into a folder with that day's date.
Is it ever an issue that like, because all of your Avid projects write to the same numbered folders, right? Like if you have different Avid projects, it's not creating a different set of numbered folders. Does that ever become an issue if you're working on multiple projects?
I mean, absolutely.
Okay.
Um, that could definitely become an issue. You could either do very careful media management at the beginning, where you transcode everything and then move it to specific folders, or you could just keep stuff on separate drives, which is what most people do.
Okay.
So when would you link instead of importing? Let's say that you're working on a show reel and you have a bunch of performances from the last 40 years, and they're all 2-hour performances, and you need maybe like 10 minutes from each of them. If you were to go through and import 150 performances, that's a huge waste of time. So an alternative is if you link to a clip, you can then either consolidate or transcode it. So if you right click and choose consolidate transcode, you'll see that I have two options. I can consolidate or I can transcode. So those are two different things. Consolidating means that you are keeping the codec and you're moving the file from wherever it is to an Avid Media Files folder and turning it into an OP-Atom MXF. Transcoding means that you are converting the file from whatever codec it's in to the codec that you choose, and you're moving it into an Avid Media Files folder. So the whole idea behind consolidating and transcoding is that, for example, if this is my 2-hour video and I only want this tiny section right here, I can actually create a subclip and only transcode that subclip. And then I can have just that however many minute section as my media in my project instead of the entire thing. If you're on an older version of Avid, anything before this newest version, you will have to link and consolidate or transcode all of your media that's not audio. And that's because, as I mentioned before, in this version, the import engine has basically been replaced with the consolidate transcode engine. And so you can just import everything and it will do it all in the background. When you consolidate something, because you're moving it into an Avid Media Files folder, it actually has to be a codec that is native to Media Composer. And you can find out what those codecs are by just looking at what your transcode options are. So anything that's in here can be consolidated. So if you shot in ProRes 422, all you have to do is consolidate your media, and you then have that ProRes 422 in an Avid Media Files folder. So you'd want to use consolidating either when you're bringing in footage and you don't want to change the codec, or you could also use it if you want to move something from one drive to another without changing the codec. So you would just select the files that you want, you would right click, you would choose consolidate, and then you'd choose the drive that you want to move them to. And then optionally, you can have it delete the original media files when it's done. So you consolidate linked media, or you can consolidate media that's already in the system over to another drive. And the same is true with transcoding. You can transcode linked media. So for example, if you got ProRes Quad 4 or basically any codec and you want to turn it into another codec, then you would do that by transcoding. Or if you want to move something from one drive to another and change the codec in the process, you would do that by transcoding as well. So there are a couple options in transcoding that are good to know. Number one is the raster dimensions. So in more recent versions of Media Composer, if you want to keep a file small, instead of transcoding to the project dimensions, you can actually transcode to smaller dimensions. So if your project is HD and the footage you're bringing in is HD, you could actually transcode it down to 1/16 the resolution of the source, or 1/4 the resolution of the source. And that allows you to have a lower resolution proxy file, but still have the same codec that you were using for your other media that was transcoded at the normal resolution. You'll notice down here that you have an option to keep the source's frame rate or convert to the project frame rate. So if you're bringing in media, I would always recommend keeping the source frame rate. The only thing with keeping the source frame rate is that it limits the number of codecs that you can transcode to. So for example, if you're on a show and they want everything to be DNX36, if you're dealing with footage that is 2398 and you receive some 2997 footage and you go to keep sources frame rate, you're not going to have an option to transcode to DNX HD because it just doesn't give it to you here. If you go to convert to project frame rate, it gives you DNX HD as an option. But under keep source frame rate, it only gives you DNX HR or ProRes as options. I would still choose DNX HR instead of transcoding to the project frame rate, because when you get to the upres process, I mean, technically in current versions of Media Composer, you can relink across frame rates, but I wouldn't recommend it. And I also wouldn't want you to have to overcut. So I would try to keep everything at its native frame rate and transcode it to either DNX HR or ProRes if it's not natively the frame rate of your project, which would match whatever your delivery file is. You'll see down here at the bottom, there is an option for background process. So you can do background transcoding and background consolidating in Media Composer. I've had mixed luck. Sometimes I've had no problems with it. Sometimes it'll get through like 3 clips and then it'll just stall. And I won't even realize it because it's in the background. So if you're okay with babysitting it and you need to get something done and the stuff that needs to be transcoded maybe isn't that pressing, you can try it and it will definitely make it so that you can get more done. But I wouldn't use it just to use it because I haven't used it in a while, so it's probably better than it used to be, but it used to be pretty flaky. So I have never 100% trusted it. But that is also another reason that you want to link and transcode instead of import. There's no background import.
I heard that some people, and this may be beyond the scope of this class, Noah, but they transcode everything in Resolve into MXFs and then
Yes,
bring it
that is
in. Is that a
beyond the
typical
scope of this
workflow?
class. I do that.
Oh, okay.
That's beyond the scope of this class.
Okay.
No,
Or encoder,
what?
or
And
encoder.
I mean, any third-party program.
Okay, yeah.
Avid's transcoding engine it works. I will put it that way. It is definitely not the best. You can get a lot more done a lot faster with other programs. But if you're on a big project with a lot of people, you basically have to figure out what's more important, organization and consistency or time. And if organization and consistency is more important, transcode in Avid. It's slower, but it leaves less room for errors. If time is more important, especially if you're going to be the only person transcoding the media, you can use anything. You can use anything to transcode the media and then just bring it into Avid afterwards. And the way that you can bring it in is what I showed you before, where you generate Avid media, drop it into a media files folder, take the MDB, drop it into a bin. Or alternatively, if you want to generate MOV files, you link to the files and then consolidate them. Okay.
And that consolidation process should just be like immediate, right? Because you're not doing anything other than
Yeah, I mean, it's not immediate, but it's a hell of a lot faster than transcoding.
Okay.
We're going to go ahead and look at the import settings dialog. So in here, we have a bunch of different options. There's a lot of rights and wrongs in here as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot of options, but most of them are not going to work well for you. So I would strongly recommend for any image that you bring in, set your image size adjustment to resize image to fit format raster, which basically means take the image and don't change the aspect ratio, but do change the resolution. So if it's a standard def image, then keep the bars on the sides, but make it full frame. For color levels, when you're dealing with color levels, you can basically think about it as where the media came from. So if your media came from a camera, then you'll want to use the first option. which is do not modify, treat as legal range. And if your media came from a computer, like graphics or basically anything that didn't come from a camera, you'll want to use scale from full range to legal range. When you import anything into Avid, it creates media. So when you import a single frame of video in Avid, it's going to create a piece of media that has a duration. It's not just going to create a reference to that clip that is infinitely long. It will actually create, in this case, a 30-second clip of just that still frame. And you can choose how long that duration is right here. So if you're going to be cutting together a bunch of clips and let's say that you want them to last like 2 seconds a piece, you could set this to 2 seconds. And then when you import them all and drop them into a timeline, they'll be exactly the right length. Whereas if you bring them in like this at 30 seconds, if you were to drop them into a timeline, they'll all be 30 seconds long. You'll have to go in and cut out time. So then we have our field ordering. Don't mess with this. This goes back to interlacing. Just let it choose what it should be. Then we have your alpha channel. So I mentioned before that an alpha channel is basically a black and white layer on the image that says what should be opaque and what should be transparent. And different programs write different things to black and white, which is a little confusing. Some programs write black as opaque, other programs write white as opaque. And so this option right here allows you to switch between the two depending on where the file comes from. So if you choose the first one, then you're saying white should equal opaque. If you choose the second one, you're saying black should equal opaque. And if you choose the third one, you're saying, I don't want the alpha channel, just bring it in as a still image, and anything that was in the alpha, just make it black. And then at the very bottom, we have auto detect sequentially numbered files. So if you're getting B-roll, sometimes you'll get like a time lapse, and the time lapse will be a bunch of JPEGs that are sequentially numbered, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you don't have this checked and you try to import those, they will come in as 30-second clips. Every image will come in as a single 30-second clip. If you check this box, they will come in as individual frames in a clip. So that's what that sequentially numbered files checkbox is for. It's probably pretty safe to have it checked. I have it unchecked. It doesn't really matter. But if you are dealing with that, that is how you would import that footage. And that's pretty much it. There's some options in audio, but as far as I'm concerned, in reality TV, you're not going to be really changing much of any of that. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. Now here's the confusing thing. We just changed the import settings, but there's also settings for linking. And they're the exact same settings described differently. So if you look here, alpha channel, ignore alpha, invert alpha channel, link sequentially numbered images as image sequences. So the reason for this is that importing and linking have traditionally been two different things. Now they're kind of the same thing. And honestly, I'm not really sure what settings apply to what anymore. I would guess that the import settings are the first things that it looks at if you're importing, and if you're linking, then it references the link settings. But there are overlapping settings between the two. So we have a clip here that's 4:3, but that doesn't look 4:3, does it? If I'm going to link to this file, the setting that I want to look at is under link options, reformatting option. If I have it set to pillar box letterbox, it's going to respect the aspect ratio of the original file. If I have it set to stretch, it's going to stretch the file to fill the frame. Now, in a very confusing situation, the same exact setting is called something completely different in the import settings. Under import is called image size adjustment and uses different terminology. So if you go to import that file, instead of linking to it, then it should look the same as what I brought in just now, because I have it set to the correct option. Yeah, it looks the same. So despite the difference in terminology, functionally, the import and link settings have a lot of overlap. Next, we have motion graphics. So the most important thing to keep in mind with motion graphics is your alpha channel. So if you import something, you'll see here I have a graphic, but it looks like we can only see the outline. If it doesn't look correct, you want to go back into the source browser and take a look at your import settings, and you want to check your alpha channel setting. So most likely, if it comes in like that, then you need to actually do the opposite of whichever one you just tried. So I'll go ahead and choose invert on import, and I'll hit import again. And you'll see that it now came in correctly. Now, motion graphics are another thing that could not be imported in versions of Media Composer before 2023.12. So in those versions, you would want to link and transcode. So if you go up to File, under Media, go to Media Creation Settings, you will see you have a bunch of tabs in here. The idea behind this window is basically you can tell it what format and what drive you want each of these things to go to. If you were to capture something, for example, or import media, or mix down and transcode, or generate motion effects, or render, you can choose what drive and what resolution you want by default that media to come in as. And one thing to note in here, if you're on a show and you're working with a bunch of editors, usually editors won't be importing media, but maybe they're going to be bringing in like their VOs that they record. If you don't trust that they're going to be putting stuff in the right place, you can actually go into their system with their permission, and you can make it so that anything that they import goes to the correct drive at the correct resolution. And you can even filter out the system drive and the launch drive so that there's no way that they could possibly write the files to their local drive. So there's one more thing that I wanted to cover in talking about media, which is our source settings. So when you're bringing footage in, there are two more things in here that are good to know. One is FrameFlex. Basically with FrameFlex, the idea is that you can reposition your video however you want. Let's say that you bring something in the wrong aspect ratio. Let's say you bring this in and you bring it in wrong so that it is stretched. Well, you don't have to re-import it. You can actually go into your source settings and change it from stretch to pillar box letterbox and then hit apply. It won't change the actual file on the file level, but it will change within Media Composer. Then we have color encoding, and color encoding is where you would apply a LUT when you bring in footage. So let's say that you're bringing something in like this ProRes clip and you want it to look a little poppier, or let's say that it's like linear or something like that, and you want to apply a LUT to it. So you can either add a LUT here, like linear to Rec 709. This is going to look really weird because this isn't actually linear. You can either add a LUT like that, and you can actually layer LUTs on top of each other. So you could add that one, you could add a full range to video levels, or you can bring in a custom LUT or a downloaded LUT by going to color management settings and then going to select LUT file. But you can download LUTs from the internet, and then you can import them here, and then you can apply them to your footage. So you're not limited to the LUTs that show up in this list. Okay, so I'm going to hit OK. So now when I go to transcode this, what if I want to include that LUT? So if I go in here and I go to Consolidate Transcode, under Transcode, you'll see there are two options here at the bottom. Apply Source Transformations, Color Encoding, and FrameFlex. So color encoding is the color encoding tab that I was showing you, where we applied those LUTs, and FrameFlex is the FrameFlex tab. So if I check these boxes and then I transcode this, it will burn in the LUTs in the color encoding tab, and then it will burn in the framing in the FrameFlex tab. All right, so let's say I have an editor who's already cutting with this footage, right? And I realized that the footage was brought in wrong. So I could either ask the editor if I could overcut it. I could do what's called batch re-import, which basically means that you replace the media and keep all the references to it. Or if it's just a matter of changing the source settings, like maybe I didn't apply a LUT that I should have, or something like that. What I can do is I can go into the source settings, I can change or do whatever I need to do. I can make the changes in here and hit apply. You'll notice that my source clip changes, but the timeline doesn't change. The editor's timeline will not change, even if the source clip changes, unless you go up to clip, refresh sequence, and then you choose whatever the relevant thing is. So in this case, it would be aspect ratio and reformatting options. And you'll see that now that I did that, it updated in my timeline. So if you did that and you had, let's say, multiple editors working on multiple sequences You would have to make the change on your system, then ask the editors if you could have the bins, open up the bins, and then refresh the sequences. I'd say 80% of editors are extremely untechnical. The 80% that are not technical, if you ask them to do technical things, either they'll do them wrong, which I would say most of the time they will do, or they'll say, yeah, sure, I'll do that, and then it'll never happen. So I would say, unless it's something that the editor specifically has to do themselves, do it for them. They will appreciate it, and you will save yourself a lot of headaches. All of that stuff, as far as media management, should not be done by an editor. Even a technical editor, you should not let them do your work. Not because you don't like them, but because by letting them do your work, you're leaving more room for issues. Everything should be done at the same point in the process.